Good evening, everyone. We have about 1 minute before we start our program. The time is 5:59. We'll start in about 1 minute here. Thank you. And a good Wednesday afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this presentation of Gus Grissom and the Liberty Bell 7 through the Pikes Peak Library District. My name is Brian Matthews, and it was 60 years ago that two suborbital flights on the Redstone Rocket put America's first two astronauts into space. On May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard in the Freedom 7. And then on July 21st, 1961, Gus Grissom in the Liberty Bell 7. After a successful suborbital flight, the Liberty Bell 7 sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, where it remained until being recovered in 1999. It is now part of the collection at the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas. We are very happy to welcome Shannon Whetzel, curator at the Cosmosphere Museum, for a presentation this evening. The program will last until about 6:45 p.m. If you have any questions you would like to submit during the program, please do so in the chat box located on your Zoom window, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get to some of them at the end. And of course, I would encourage anyone with an interest in space to visit the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas, which is about a 7-hour drive from Colorado Springs. You can visit their website, cosmo.org, to see all their museum has to offer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shannon. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Yes, thank you for having me. Absolutely. It's so exciting to be here. Now, let me see if I can share my screen and lightning can strike twice. So yes, as Brian mentioned, this is actually about, in July will be the 60th anniversary of the flight of Liberty Bell 7. Liberty Bell 7 was the second US manned mission. So Alan Shepard went first in Freedom 7. There is a lot of significance to Liberty Bell 7 as well. As Brian mentioned, it did sink to the bottom of the ocean and was recovered, I believe, 38 years later. So before we begin, just to let you know, I am Shannon Whetzel. I'm the curator here at the Cosmosphere. My background is history. I have a bachelor's in history and I have a master's in public history, which I like to romantically call the study of how we remember things, although I assure you that my classes were not nearly as romantic as that sounds. So I've been here about 7 years. I don't have a background in space history. I was hired for my preservation background. So the cool thing about that is that every day I learn something new about space history. One of those things that has been reiterated over and over is that I would never, ever, ever go to space. But I know there are many out there who would, and I appreciate their pioneer spirit. So, Liberty Bell 7, a suborbital mission, I'll explain that a little bit. When we think about going into space now, we think about the space station that orbits the Earth. Suborbital literally means that Liberty Bell 7 popped up into the air and then came right back down. It did not orbit the Earth. It was about a 15-minute flight. It was the second manned mission of the U.S. manned spaceflight program, Mercury. It occurred on July 21st, 1961. And let's get started. So who were the first astronauts, the first U.S. astronauts? I'll try to make that distinction every time I mention them, but just to be clear, we are talking about the United States and not the Soviet program, which is a whole other part of space history. So after some rigorous screening, 7 candidates were picked to become the first 7 astronauts. You can see their pictures right here. The silver spacesuits. There was a purpose to the silver. It was reflective, but you got to admit it also looks pretty good and spacey and futuristic for the 1960s. And then on the other side, that's my left, on the left there is the candidates, and we are in particular talking about Gus Grissom, who is right there in the middle. And one thing you'll notice is that these guys were not very big in stature. So not only did they have to meet some pretty hefty requirements, they had to have so many hours of flight time. They were test pilots. They had height limitations and weight limitations. And they also had to have a bachelor's degree. So out of, I'm trying to think, there were several hundred, it got narrowed down to 7. So that is a picture of them during some of their training. And just a personal favorite of mine, some of their training involved survival training. So you can see the picture, the lower picture is the 7 Mercury astronauts participating in Air Force survival training in Nevada. So you can see that portions of their clothing have been fashioned from parachute material, and all have just grown beards from their time in the wilderness. And the purpose of this training was to prepare the astronauts in the event of an emergency landing in a remote area. So kind of funny when we talk about Gus Grissom's flight in particular, which was really only 15 minutes long, he had a pretty hefty survival kit, including what we like to point out here is a bar of dial soap, which for a 15-minute flight, I don't know why you would need soap, but he had it just in case. Speaking specifically to the training that Gus Grissom had to go through, you can see here he is in various simulators, and he's being attached, the sensors are being attached to him so that they can track his heart rate and all of that. So the testing that these guys went through was much more rigorous than what they have to do today. Something really interesting about the space program that I like to point out, because again, I don't have that background, is how in the beginning, we really didn't know what was going to happen to the human body in space. Neither did the Soviets. So in the beginning, President Eisenhower insisted on test pilots as the first astronauts because they would be more prepared for that, those split-second decisions that might need to be made, or putting their bodies through some harsher situations than, say, other people like scientists or engineers would be. So in the beginning, they were choosing people for their physical health. And after a couple of flights, we realized that that wasn't as important. And that's when you start seeing scientists and engineers and other people going up into space. And you just have to love a photo that has JFK in it. So here they are meeting JFK at the top. And then Gus was also the backup for Alan Shepard's flight. So the bottom corner is Alan Shepard preparing for his flight to be the first US manned mission. There was a Soviet mission that happened a couple weeks before his. So the Soviets were technically the first to get a man into space. Alan Shepard was the first from the United States. So Gus is there in the suit, kind of as backup. He was more or less Alan Shepard's shadow throughout the process. And again, you kind of just get to see the photos I love. I love that photo of him on the left smiling as he's being suited up into his spacesuit. And then the picture on the right is him with his spacecraft, Liberty Bell 7. So the launch of Liberty Bell 7 occurred on the Redstone Rocket, which you see on the right. The Mercury capsule is there on top. Essentially, one of the first questions I asked when I got here is, what's the difference between a missile and a rocket? And someone kind of jokingly said to me, the payload. So a missile would have a bomb on top and a rocket would have a person or a satellite, which is funny, but also kind of true. So this Redstone rocket has a, has the Mercury, or the Mercury spacecraft on top of it. But the Redstone rocket was also originally an ICBM, an intercontinental, what does that stand for? Ballistic missile. So it was a weapon before it was used for the launching of humans into space. I'll go off on my tangents, I'm sorry. I'm an hour behind you guys, so it's later here. But another interesting thing about space history to me is that I'm of the shuttle age. So to me, we've always been in space for scientific reasons, to explore the universe and to, work with our international colleagues and all of that. And it was very interesting to me when the light kind of went off when I started here and realized that we actually went into space for very different reasons in the beginning, especially during the Cold War. But I digress. Anyway, so yes, so that was the Mercury Redstone 4. MR4 is what the mission was called. And the spacecraft was the first to have a window to give a panoramic view of Earth. Alan Shepard didn't have that. And it also had a new hatch, which becomes very important to our story later on. So I want to point that out. It had a new hatch. And the flight was so short that 5 minutes after blastoff, he was preparing to land. And as you can see here, he is actually getting picked up by the helicopter pilot. The helicopter circled and then the capsule and then was ready to haul it to safety. And the hatch on the spacecraft blew prematurely. So Grissom had to crawl out as water filled the spacecraft. And something that the pilot did point out later on during the recovery mission was that, yes, Liberty Bell was a lost spacecraft. Yes, Gus Grissom came dangerously close to drowning. But their contingency plans that they had practiced for worked. And the astronaut was rescued and walked away from it. So a very optimistic view of what was kind of viewed as a failure. So here he is trying to pull up the spacecraft. And so the controversy that I kind of wanted to get into is that the hatch blew prematurely. And there were some who thought that Grissom panicked and blew the hatch. And that's what caused all of this. And if you're familiar with the movie The Right Stuff or the book, I personally could not read it. Tom Wolfe was a bit too much for me. But the story, I mean, it was good, but it was difficult. Those of you, and I'm speaking to a library crowd, so you guys should check it out if you haven't. But the movie implied that he blew the hatch prematurely as well, and that he was panicking in the spacecraft. And there are all kinds of theories behind this. The Mercury 7 astronauts really kind of got behind Grissom on this, and each time they flew, they would try to blow the hatch, and they would come away with giant bruises on their arms because it was so difficult to blow the hatch. So the implying here that Gus should have had giant bruises all over himself, or it should have been much more difficult to do. and that more than likely this new hatch probably malfunctioned. So as the spacecraft filled with water, it got heavier and heavier. With the water, the spacecraft weighed over 4,000 pounds. The helicopter engine began to overload and it had to be dropped. Now, the whole time this is happening, Gus is in the water flailing around. And at first, the pilot thinks that Gus is just waving, but it turns out his suit is filling with water and he's starting to get pulled under. So a very harrowing couple minutes for him that probably felt like a lifetime. He was eventually pulled out of the water and rescued, though. And here he is leaving the spacecraft. As I mentioned, the controversy over the hatch, and it really, if you look at footage from the time, it really did kind of like news footage. It put a damper on the mission, which it really shouldn't have. But it was viewed a little bit as a failure, kind of like Apollo 13, if you're familiar with that story. But so Liberty Bell, the spacecraft, sat on the bottom of the ocean for 38 years. And with the help of funding from the Discovery Channel, and I think the company was Oceaneering, Kurt Newport was able to bring the spacecraft up to the surface. And I'll stop here right now because if you are interested in this subject, there is a fantastic documentary. I think it's just called Finding Liberty Bell, and it is on YouTube. And I think there's even a link from our website. And James Earl Jones narrates it. It's fantastic. So if you are interested, I think it's like an hour and a half. You should check that out. It has a lot of footage from the recovery, as well as diving into the historic part of the story. So I encourage you to check that out. And I purposefully put that here so that I would remember when I saw the Discovery Channel logo to mention it. So as I mentioned, Kurt Newport spearheaded this operation. He's there in the middle in the white t-shirt. And our former CEO, Max Airy, is on the left. The Cosmosphere was brought in because of its history. Our SpaceWorks restoration team has a history of restoring spacecraft. They've done several Gemini spacecraft as well as Apollo. And so then this Mercury was quite a prize as well. So here they are, and they're going over locations. In the back, standing in the black shirt, he is part of the bomb squad, which I think we will get into shortly, because there's some really good pictures of what he pulled out of the spacecraft. So spoiler alert, the spacecraft had a bomb in it. And here they are. Here he is just working on the computer, looking at the coordinates. And something you'll, if you watch the documentary, that's really kind of cool is that they found several targets. They had to search an area the size of Manhattan, looking for something about the size of a refrigerator. And so they found several targets using sonar. And then when they sent the ROV down there, the first target was Liberty Bell. So it was pretty exciting. It's a pretty exciting moment in the documentary. And again, here they are just using that sonar and looking at trying to figure out where exactly Liberty Bell is. And I don't think I mentioned it, but the goal wasn't to solve the hatch mystery, but that would have been a really cool part of it. But the hatch was not recovered. So I'll just go ahead and say that now. I won't keep that until the end. And here's Liberty Bell on the bottom of the ocean. Sat on the bottom of the ocean for 38 years. The recovery team had to use special clamps. I think I have a picture of those. Yeah, here they are. They had to design special clamps to raise it. All all with the possibility that that top ring is just going to pop off and there's no way to support the weight of the spacecraft. But surprise, they were able to raise Liberty Bell. What a great photo. Kind of a cool little fact. The spacecraft was raised on the 30-year anniversary of the moon landing. And it took 7 hours to get it out of the ocean. And so, of course, the first thing people want to do is just run right over to it, obviously. And there were several. The helicopter pilot who was trying to pull Liberty Bell out of the water initially, he was there, as well as the pad leader, Gunter Wendt, he was there. And so a really exciting moment. And again, if you watch the documentary, you'll see it. But so everyone wanted to rush the spacecraft and see what the inside looked like. But the spacecraft was armed. So this is the bomb squad. The craft contained several explosive devices. The hatch had already detonated, so they knew that those weren't going to go off. But it also contained what they call a SOFAR bomb. SOFAR stands for sound fixing and ranging. And they were small explosive devices that were attached to the Mercury spacecraft so that if it were necessary, they could make those go off, and then they would indicate where the splashdown location was in case they couldn't find it. It's used in aircraft as well, but supposedly it was supposed to detonate upon sinking, but it didn't. So the first thing was the crew safety and the difficulty of getting everyone away from it after it had been raised. So luckily the bomb was removed, no issues, no one got hurt, it all went very well. And so here he is holding it. That's quite a job. You know, I say I have a cool job, and that's probably a cool moment in his job, but I don't think I'd want it all the time. I mentioned Kurt Newport again. Here he is standing with his prize, Liberty Bell. He had been working on raising Liberty Bell, I think it was for 14 years or something like that. So this was a pretty historic moment for him as well. And just checking out the spacecraft. And again, that's our former CEO, Max Airy, there at the top. So this is Liberty Bell arriving at the Cape. Another cool little tidbit. It arrived at the Cape, at Cape Canaveral, on the anniversary of the flight on July 21st. So exactly 38 years later, probably planned, but still a very cool thing. So you'll see that as we'll move into the preservation process here fairly quickly. Actually, right now, I think we'll see. You know, I go off on those tangents. So they put the spacecraft in this tank and they filled it with salt water. And the reason for that was to maintain its current situation, for lack of a better term. If it were to be allowed out of the salt water and exposed to air, it would have rusted immediately. So they kept it in the saltwater tank until we could get it to our preservation lab. So here it is in its saltwater tank. There it is again. I mentioned Gunter Wendt, the pad leader for the mission. There he is signing the tank. And just, wow, a very nice celebration. I know that documentaries can dramatize, but there were a lot of dramatic moments in the raising of Liberty Bell where cables are snapped, or sonar isn't working, or we can't check all the targets we found, and then the first one winds up being Liberty Bell. So a lot of stress. So I'm sure there was that was a good feeling right there. So you can just barely see our Redstone rocket on the right in the back. So this is when the Liberty Bell capsule arrived at our facility. They're letting all the seawater out. And here they are lowering it into our, it's not our preservation lab anymore. It's actually part of our gallery, but they had the preservation conservation work done in public view behind glass, so you could actually watch the restoration of Liberty Bell as it happened. So here they are lowering it down into what we call our pit. And just as you can see, digging through some of the muck that was in there, there were some infamous souvenirs inside the spacecraft, Mercury dimes. And this is one of our technicians finding one of those dimes. The crew, the pad crew had actually placed those souvenirs in the spacecraft, expecting it to come back, and then they would have these souvenirs that went into space. And just a close-up of some of the joystick and the dials, and well, you can't see anything, but that's what it is. Again, one of the really cool artifacts that came out of the spacecraft was the Randle Knife. The Randle Knife company personally made knives for the Mercury 7 astronauts. I'm not into knives, but these are very fancy knives. And so Gus didn't take his. His was still in the spacecraft. So a very cool artifact. And yeah, so this is the main control panel. You would never guess that, but that's what it is. And this is the bath that they put Liberty Bell in. So after they got it out of the salt water, as I mentioned, it would rust. So one of the first things they did is they flushed it with fresh water to clean the salt from it. And I think that this went on for weeks, if not months. So really flushing out any of that salt water that was on it. And then they had to take approximately 25,000 parts off of it. They removed them and cleaned them individually. The entire preservation was about a 6-month process. So that main control panel, right? Well, here it is. I like how they have such amazing technical skills and they know so much, and then you just see that fan down there at the bottom. But they definitely did clean up the control panel quite a bit. You'll notice it's kind of hard to tell, but on the right side, that control panel over there looks a little green. They did have to use plexiglass on the parts that were too deteriorated. So I believe that part of the control panel is made out of plexiglass. And here are all the shingles that they had to pull off. Again, as I said, it was each piece individually. So they pulled all of the shingles off, and then you can see on the bottom right, they did actually have to shear the spacecraft open after the shingles came off in order to effectively clean it out. I think I have another picture of that. Yeah, so you can see over on the right is that bottom half of it. Yeah, so a very cool project. Very fun research too, I imagine. And here's part of that, what I was calling the restoration lab. You can see where they're working. To the left is the glass where the public could view it. This is Buck Buckingham. He was originally one of our really amazing restorers. He actually led this project as well as the Apollo 13 restoration. And here are just some pictures of some of the pieces that were pulled out. You can see they used dental picks to clean them. And the Randle knife that I mentioned, the picture with all the muck. This is how it got cleaned up. And again, here you can see that's part of his medical kit. So you can see it in the top left, soaking, and then what it looks like after it was cleaned up. he had some, looks like something, morphine for pain, something for motion sickness, a stimulant. So another cool thing, like I said, I don't have the space history background, is one of the other cool things I think is that they really planned for everything, even on a suborbital flight. Here is his survival kit. There's a desalter kit to turn salt water into drinking water, a signal mirror, the dial soap, a more traditional pocket knife, a whistle. One of the things that's kind of funny that came out of it was a Boy Scout container that has matches in it. So it has the Boy Scout logo on it. The helicopter recovery hook, you can see it before restoration on the left, and then after restoration on the right. Again, another little souvenir. Once Liberty Bell was pulled up to the surface, the Cosmosphere started receiving calls from people who had been involved in the project saying, by the way, we rolled up some dollar bills for souvenirs and stuck them inside the spacecraft. So some of the dollar bills that were found. And here's an external shingle, arguably the more famous one on the whole spacecraft, but you can see how it was cleaned up. And here is, this is the volunteer crew. So not only was it our SpaceWorks crew, but we brought on volunteers. The man in on the bottom left, Larry, he volunteered here for I think 25 years. And then this is the SpaceWorks crew. Of this crew, the only one left is Dale Capps. He's on the back right. He's still here, so he gets to tell us all the stories. And so here's the final shot of Liberty Bell after restoration. They did a great job. And then here, just a photo of it in our gallery. And then Liberty Bell is the only spacecraft from a manned mission that is owned privately. We own Liberty Bell 7. So with that, we are allowed to do traveling exhibits with it. And so periodically Liberty Bell goes out on for traveling. And so here again, pulling it out of the pit that you saw it going into originally to go, I believe on this trip it was going to Germany. Liberty Bell is currently on display here with plans to go to Brazil at the end of May. So I highly encourage you, if you'd like to see Liberty Bell, it's right up there in our lobby. You can come by, but we do ask that you come before the end of May. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, for that wonderful presentation there. And we do have one question here with a sad answer, which I'll let you give, about, was Gus Grissom still alive when the bill was retrieved?
Yeah, so Gus Grissom survived Liberty Bell, the original sinking, but no, unfortunately, Gus Grissom died in the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, I believe. So another thing that, as Brian and I were talking earlier, that I always say the Cosmosphere is biased about Gus Grissom. We think that he was a professional and he more than likely did not blow the hatch prematurely himself. It probably malfunctioned, but something we point to is that NASA chose Grissom to be on the first manned Gemini mission, and then again on the first manned Apollo mission. And unfortunately, when they were testing the Apollo 1 spacecraft here on Earth, it wasn't even in space, there was a fire and he died in that fire. So no, unfortunately, if you watch the documentary, his brother is there though, so that's nice.
And another question here. I know the person asks, I know the hatch was never recovered, but was the expedition able to locate it? And then also, when will Liberty Bell 7 be returning to the Cosmosphere from Brazil?
Okay. No, they never did locate the hatch, which, like I said, I don't have a space background. So when I first heard the story of Liberty Bell, I was obviously, that's awesome. And then the disappointment of not finding the hatch. And of course, that was not the goal, but it really would have been cool if they did not. And really, honestly, right now with the COVID situation, I can't tell you. I can't be for sure when Liberty Bell is going, and then I think it will be gone for 4 months. So it all depends on when it actually heads out. We've put the end of May as the current kind of dead cutoff to see Liberty Bell, because before it can go out on loan, we do like to do a little bit of prep work on the case and on the craft itself. So it will be pulled at this point, end of May, so that it can go to our restoration center and they can start prepping it for the long ocean journey to Brazil. As I always say, when it gets into an ocean shipping container, keep your fingers crossed for us. But definitely through the end of May, and you can watch our social media. Of course, if something changes and we are going to keep it longer, we try to keep it on display as long as we can. So if you watch our social media and our website, if something gets updated, we'll put it there.
And we have a couple of minutes left, so if there are any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. The website for the Cosmosphere is cosmo.org. And aside, the Liberty Bell 7, of course, seems to be the one of the premier artifacts that the museum has. But what other what other artifacts does the museum hold? I seem to remember reading somewhere that it's one of the largest collections of space memorabilia outside of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I don't know if we can make that claim, but I would like to. But we do say that we have the largest Russian collection. So we have, I think that's something that sets us apart from other space museums, is that through artifacts, we can tell the full story of the Soviet side and the American side during the Cold War, during the space race. So if you haven't been here and you're interested in that full story, we have flown, or we have a Vostok spacecraft, which is what Yuri Gagarin would have been in. Ours is flown. It was flown in the 80s as a satellite, not during manned missions. But still, it's very interesting to see how the atmosphere affected the outside of the craft. We also have a Voskhod, not flown, but that depicts how the Russians performed the first spacewalk, as well as a Gemini spacecraft from the American side, and Apollo 13 is here on display right now. So you should come.
And somebody asked, will Liberty Bell still be there over Memorial Day?
I believe we're saying until May 31st. So, and I think Memorial Day is a little before that, right? May 28th.
Yeah, the last Monday of the month or so.
Yeah, so until May 31st at the least.
I have another comment here. Thank you. Well done presentation. Love that
you
expanded the slides to the full screen. Made it so much easier to see those. And of course, we do thank Shannon for being with us here on
absolutely.
This Wednesday. What can I say? You also do a program you had talked about before we went live here, coffee, what is it, Coffee with the Cosmosphere?
Yeah, coffee, it used to be Coffee at the Cosmosphere, but things have changed. But yes, we have turned our coffee program into a virtual program. You can go to our YouTube channel and see recordings. And yeah, this was actually kind of a good time for me to do this, because we just did one on comparing Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet and the first man in space, to Alan Shepard, who was the first US man in space. So you can check that out too. That was a lot of fun. And those early astronauts, we always say, those were the real cowboys.
And like you had said earlier too, the Russian side of the space story is so interesting itself too. We all know the American side, but between the propaganda and the state-run history and the private journals, you just get a fascinating view of what the space race was like.
Yeah, and really interesting on their side too was, I mean, they were the first, so they really didn't know how space was going to affect the human body. And it's interesting too when you look at the story, how the US and the Soviets both took technology from Nazi Germany to make their rockets. But it's interesting to see how those two sides not working together came up with completely different ideas and completely similar ideas. So it's interesting to see the way the technology moved on these two different sides.
I have another question here for you about the Liberty Bell. It was kept in salt water until it was ready for restoration. The rusting was on the rusting was on the outside elements only. How about the interior? Was the freshwater rinse sufficient to prevent rusting all around?
Yes, yes, it actually is in pretty amazing condition. And one way the case that it sits in is completely climate controlled. It has its own temperature controls. It has its own humidity controls. Especially when you're sending it out, you have to have it in its own environment. Keeping it in low humidity, or at least not letting the humidity get too high, will cause active corrosion. So that is something we look out for. But yeah, so far it's held up to the test of time, and that's up to our restoration guys. They did a really good job.
Excellent. And then back to the previous thing we talked about the Cosmosphere, Coffee at the Cosmosphere. You said the recording of the program where you talked about Shepard and Yuri Gagarin, it's on the YouTube channel?
It is on our YouTube channel.
Okay, so check out the YouTube channel of the Cosmosphere, located in Hutchinson, Kansas. Looks like our time is coming to an end here. Need to end close to 6:45 today. I'd like to remind everyone that this presentation will be represented on the library's YouTube channel, ppld.org on the YouTube. So if you have any friends or anyone, or would like to watch it again yourself, please check it out. We'll try to get it up in a couple of days here. My technical operator here, the other Shannon, and thank you so much for helping with the Zoom program today, has put up a link for the YouTube channel for the Cosmosphere.
Oh, fantastic. What do we do without our tech people?
I tell you, boy, both be up the creek. So I'll also try to put this link in the library market entry for this. And of course, feel free to contact me as well. Thank you, Irene, for sharing this story with us. Good job. And thank you very much, Shannon Whetzel from the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas. Great to have you with us this evening.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was nice to be here. Or there, it was nice to be with you.
And it was fantastic having you with us. So thank you for attending our program, and have a good night.
Yes, thank you.